Meeting 155 of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts.
In place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Before we begin, I would ask all in-person participants to read the guidelines written on the updated cards on the table. These measures are in place to help prevent audio and feedback incidents and to protect the health and safety of all participants, including our interpreters. A kind reminder to all those in person and online that for the safety of our interpreters, that it is very important that your microphone is muted when you are not speaking. Merci à tous pour votre coopération. Conformément à l'article.
Thank you all for your cooperation. Pursuant to the standing orders, the meeting is meeting today as part of its study of the 2024 reports 8 to 12 of the Auditor General of Canada.
Welcome our witnesses from the Office of the Auditor General. We have Karen Hogan, Auditor General of Canada. Thank you for coming in today and bringing your entire team, who I'll just run through here, along with Mr. Andrew Hayes, Deputy Auditor General, Mélanie Cabana, Principal, Jean Goulet, Principal, Sami Hanouch, Principal, Gabrielle Lombardi, Principal, Nicholas Swale, Principal. Thank you all for being here today. Ms. Hogan, you have the floor for an opening presentation, please.
Mr. Chair, I am pleased to be here today to discuss my fall reports, which were tabled in the House of Commons. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. My office delivered 5 performance audit reports and a special examination report to Parliament today. The performance audit reports touch on whether government organizations are delivering expected results for Canadians. Qu'il s'agisse de gérer des programmes pour les personnes âgées,
whether managing programs for seniors or youth, or supporting the economy through benefits or loan programs, or improving access to secure online services for everyone, government organizations should be diligent and transparent in their management of tax dollars.
Dans notre premier audit,
in our first audit, we looked at whether Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada implemented the Industrial and Technological Benefits Policy so that its objectives were met. The policy requires that companies who are awarded defense contracts also invest in Canada for an equal amount. During the period we audited, it applied to 99 procurements totaling at least $39 billion.
Overall, we found that the department could not demonstrate that the policy met its objectives. The department had not established clear rules and guidance for applying the policy, which led to inconsistencies. Of eligible procurements over $100 million, we found 2 in which the contractor's commitments were below 100% of the contract value, and 8 that included no obligations at all. We also found that the department lacked effective ways to measure the policy's economic benefits and the creation of jobs, and that it did not track the potential impacts of the policy on defense procurement. Étant donné l'ampleur des obligations que la politique...
Given the extent of obligations for contractors under the Industrial and Technological Benefits Policy, it is important that Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada has effective ways to show whether the policy contributes to jobs, innovation, and economic growth. Our next audit examined the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat's efforts to lead the development of a national approach for digitally validating a person's identity. A national approach is important to ensure seamless and secure access to online services in the public and private sectors for Canadians across the country.
That the Secretariat had delayed work on a national approach because of a lack of funding. However, it had worked with Employment and Social Development Canada and Shared Services Canada on a needed component of a national approach, a one-stop online sign-in system that validates a person's identity to access federal services. This would replace the almost 90 separate sign-in portals currently managed by individual federal departments. Some provinces and territories have begun implementing their own identity and access management programs. This means that digital access across levels of government is evolving without common parameters or guidance. A national approach would ensure the interoperability of secure and reliable identity validation systems across public and private sectors. As we concluded our audit, it was unclear whether the development of a national approach would proceed and whether the transition to a new federal sign-in system could be funded without presenting an unmanageable financial burden on federal organizations. Nos trois autres audits ont porté sur des programmes.
Our other three audits examined programs and services that directly support people and businesses in Canada. The first of these, the Canada Summer Jobs Program, provides subsidies to eligible employers to create jobs for youth aged 15 to 30. We worked with Statistics Canada to analyze available data and found that youth benefit from this program. While many factors influence long-term employment results, our analysis shows that after 9 years, participants in the Canada Summer Jobs Program earned on average almost $6,000 more per year than non-participants. We also found that since 2008, youth facing barriers have not been well represented in the program, which is concerning because the program is meant to prioritize work opportunities for this group.
Employment and Social Development Canada did not collect or analyze data to know how many summer jobs the funding created or to report on long-term outcomes for participants in the program. Given the benefits that this program delivers, the department needs to use data to improve the success of all youth in the labor market, including priority groups. Our next audit examined programs to support seniors. In 2023, there were 7.5 million people over the age of 65 in Canada, a total that could almost double within 20 years. In 2018, Employment and Social Development Canada was tasked with supporting the Minister of Seniors to better understand and meet the needs of seniors. We found that the department did not have a complete picture of the issues faced by seniors or the programs in place across Canada to serve them. Le programme de la sécurité de la vie.
The Old Age Security Program is meant to strengthen seniors' income security. We found that the department could not show whether the basic level of payment under the program was sufficient to support seniors' financial needs. Although old age security payments are regularly adjusted for inflation by using the Consumer Price Index, the department could not show whether seniors faced a different level of inflation than Canadians in general. We also found that the department had not set itself up to successfully measure outcomes under the New Horizons for Seniors program. The department relied on information in applications to measure the impact of the program without knowing if funded projects delivered the intended results.
Comme la population.
As the population of seniors in Canada continues to grow, Employment and Social Development Canada needs to strengthen its analysis to ensure that support programs are meeting the evolving needs of seniors.
Notre dernier audit.
Our final audit examined the Canada Emergency Business Account Program, or CEBA. This program was put in place during the COVID-19 pandemic to help small Canadian businesses cover expenses they could not defer.
EDC acted quickly to provide $49.1 billion in loans to help almost 900,000 small businesses across Canada. However, the program was not managed with due regard for value for money. We found significant weaknesses in EDC's contract management. It relied on a single vendor, Accenture, to deliver the program. The non-competitive contracts awarded to Accenture represented 92% of the total value of $342 million in contracts related to the CEBA program. EDC gave too much control to Accenture over key aspects of contracts, such as the scope of work and pricing. EDC failed to exercise basic controls in contract management, such as monitoring whether amounts paid aligned with the work performed. Since ongoing program delivery uses Accenture's proprietary IT systems, EDC will have to rely on these non-competitive contracts until at least 2028. Nous avons également constaté
We also found that neither the Department of Finance nor Global Affairs Canada provided effective oversight of value for money. There was an accountability void that resulted in basic program elements, including measuring outcomes, being delayed or not completed. Finance Canada did not challenge EDC's administrative spending or provide an overall spending limit. As of March 31st, 2024, that spending totaled $853 million.
91% of loans were issued to eligible businesses. We estimated that about $3.5 billion went to ineligible recipients. I am concerned that EDC only partially agreed with our recommendation that it should carry out additional work to identify all ineligible recipients and recover the amounts involved. Unlike other COVID-19 programs, CEBA is a loan program with repayments that will be ongoing for several years, while action on defaulted loans is just beginning. Value for money will be further compromised without better monitoring and improved plans to recover on defaulted loans. Mr. Chair, this concludes my opening remarks. We are now pleased to answer any questions committee members may have. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Auditor General. It's my intention to get through 2 full rounds, which will take us to about 12:20, I expect. The first round will consist of 4 members, 6 minutes each, although members can split their time. I understand, Mr. Halan, you'll be opening up for us today. You have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thanks, Chair. Ms. Hogan, thank you to you and your team for putting this report together. Once again, we're here. We're here talking about another sad example of Liberal waste and abuse of taxpayer money and pure government incompetence, just like what we saw with CERB and again with Arrive Scam. This time it's $3.5 billion of CEBA loans that went to ineligible recipients. Ms. Hogan, is this incompetence not due to lack of proper oversight and of a lack of safeguards with taxpayers' money?
I think the first thing I would want to point out about the Canada Emergency Business Account was the speed at which $49 billion of loans went out to businesses. Waiting less than a month is very quick. But the rollout of this program did have some questionable elements when it came to contract management by Export Development Canada. So while 91% of loans went to eligible businesses, we did identify that $3.5 billion went to ineligible businesses. Export Development Canada has already started to recover some of those, but I am concerned that they have partially disagreed or partially accepted our recommendation about following up, and this concern, this lack of following up concerns me.
Was this not because of a lack of safeguards?
Well, issuing loans to ineligible recipients is about having payment controls. So with most COVID programs, this one too had limited prepayment controls.
Right.
While there were some validation checks, loans did go out to ineligible businesses. What we did see EDC do, however, was adjust at the beginning and start doing post-payment work, which was different compared to other COVID programs.
Sorry, I just have a limited amount of time, so I have to move on. So we know that Accenture was given, once again, by the Liberals, a sole source contract. This is a multinational corporation that was awarded a sole source contract. Almost 92% of contracts went to them. to once again cover up the incompetence of the ministers on the Liberal side. This company took Canadians to the cleaners, and that almost $300 million plus went to Accenture. But what did Canadians get for that? Does it not say that giving this sole source contract to Accenture means that this government had bungled the program?
So this is a different program than other COVID programs. We actually here saw Crown Corporation delivering a program that normally we would have expected to see delivered from the public service. Because of that, I would have expected better oversight by the Department of Finance and Global Affairs, and they really did fail in their responsibilities to exercise oversight over that Crown. When the EDC decided to issue non-competitive contracts to Accenture, I'm concerned about the over-reliance that they have put on this one single vendor.
Right.
And the lack of oversight by departments
Right.
is such that bad decisions are not being questioned, and
Right.
I would have expected better from the use of public funds.
You said in previous reports that the government can't use COVID as an excuse for this kind of incompetence. Is this not another example of that happening again?
I would expect a basic level of due diligence and monitoring regardless of the situation. And here what we saw was a poor contract management from Export Development Canada and lack of oversight by federal departments of a Crown Corporation administering a significant COVID support program.
Thank you. Mr. McCauley, I understand you're going to pick it up from here.
Yes,
You've got
thanks.
2 minutes and 15 seconds. Floor is yours.
Thanks, A.J. Hogan. Thanks very much. Just quickly on the public accounts, last Wednesday in Senate Finance, a senior TBS official said, and I quote, "The public accounts have been transmitted to the AG." Do you have the final version of the public accounts yet?
I expect to receive the final version of the financial statements today. That was what I was informed of at the end of last week.
So they did not, as TBS said, send you the public accounts for final sign-off?
We don't have the final statements. Our audit is ongoing, and obviously we
Thanks.
work with different versions,
I
but
question
we
why
don't have the
Treasury
final
Board would
ones.
actually state that publicly. But thanks for your work on the CEBA. You know, we've spent a lot of time on ArriveCan. I thought just when you can't think get a worse report than ArriveCan, along comes EDC saying, "Hold my beer." There's a line from your report that says Accenture was involved in proposing solutions to implementing program changes, determining contract scope and prices with little challenge from EDC. Can you expand on that? Like, this seems very much like GC Strategies being involved in setting up RFPs that only they could win.
So these contracts were all issued in a non-competitive fashion to Accenture. We did conclude that EDC handed over too much control to this vendor.
Did they violate procurement rules by allowing Accenture to basically choose themselves for subcontracting?
So the Crown Corporation isn't subject to the government's procurement rules. They have their own set of rules.
But that doesn't allow them to throw away taxpayers' money by giving business to themselves, setting their own prices.
I agree. There was an over-reliance here on hourly-based contracts, which is not what you would typically see in the public service. Having fixed price is the better approach to ensure better value for money. EDC here handed over too much control in those hourly contracts, saying, "Help us with the scope and how much will this cost," when I would have expected much better from the public service when it comes to managing a contract.
I would have expected the public service not to give a contract to Accenture and tell them you can take taxpayers' money and hire your own self and set your own prices and decide how much taxpayers would pay for those services. Would you not?
You're highlighting a process where Accenture, or where EDC and Finance and Global Affairs had identified the need to move to a competitive process because they were concerned about the over-reliance on Accenture. EDC, however, turned to Accenture and asked them to run a mini competitive process to find a vendor to develop a loan accounting software. In the end, what happened is that a recommendation was made to provide the work to a wholly owned subsidiary of Accenture. So in effect, they ran a competition and then received the contract, and that is unacceptable.
sounds like
in the
fraud.
public
Mr.
service.
McCauley,
Sounds like fraud.
Mr. McCauley, we are well over our time. I'm
you.
moving on to Mr. Erskine Smith, please. You have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thanks very much. It's interesting to listen to colleagues who, if you were to take them seriously, we might have all forgotten that COVID even happened. I read with interest your findings, and specifically in relation to a not insignificant sum went to ineligible businesses. That should not have happened. You rightly made note that there was too much control given up. At the same time, when you're reflecting on the rollout and the fast rollout, and speed was the necessity in a crisis as we faced, did you expect perfection?
So I think, as I've mentioned in all my other reports on COVID relief programs, what the government did to quickly roll out funding to support businesses and individuals followed international best practices. You would expect limited prepayment controls with then the expectation that more significant work is done after the funds have been dispersed. And you rightly identify that $49.1 billion in loans was quickly dispersed to almost 900,000 businesses across the country. Most waited less than a month to receive that funding. When you recognize that the objective that in early 2020 was to help support these businesses cover expenses they just couldn't defer. That was a success. What wasn't a success?
I want to get to the especially in relation to the partial disagreement, because I note from your opening remarks that is a source of frustration. I do want to say, though, that the $49.1 billion that is rolled out and the $45.6 billion that went to recipients that were deemed eligible on your assessment, I mean, this was, in the words of the opposition leader, these were big fat government programs, and we should have just been cutting red tape and cutting taxes for small business that had no customers. And I can think of many small businesses in my riding that would not exist today were it not for a program like this. And so, I do worry that a program like this gets politicized such that people go, well, this shouldn't have happened. This should never have existed. It's all. I just heard allegations of corruption before we even got into it, as if this was worse than a Rive can. Okay, so anyway, I want to get to your frustration, because on my reading of it, I was a bit confused. EDC says they've partially agreed, and then Finance agreed with your assessment. What do you make of that?
So the recommendation you're talking to is the one that we provided to Export Development Canada in order to follow up and confirm whether or not the $1.5 billion that we identified that potentially went to ineligible recipients, to identify whether or not that's accurate. The information that we were able to look at clearly indicated that these businesses were not eligible, but an additional follow-up could happen with those businesses to confirm. EDC partially agrees because they believe that they need to do a cost-benefit analysis and follow up if there were viable recovery options, but also their view is that they don't have the mandate by the government to do that kind of work. And this is where I raised the uniqueness of this program, where a program was given to a Crown corporation that's meant to be at arm's length from the government, but is delivering something that the public service would normally deliver, which is why the accountability and oversight from Department of Finance and Global Affairs is so key. But there was so much confusion over what their roles were, and it led to what I would call an accountability void. And when that happens, no one was keeping their eye on the costs. And this program could have been delivered for less money if there was less reliance on one sole vendor through non-competitive process.
Well, let's pull those pieces apart, though, because there's the vendor issue, which let's get to that second. And first, just in relation to recouping loan forgiveness from ineligible small businesses, obviously where it makes sense to do so, where they are obviously ineligible, where they're doing their own audit, as you say. You've identified businesses. Okay, EDC, go to the work line by line to assess whether these were truly ineligible. And if they were ineligible, then what's your process for going and getting the money back? EDC has said in response to your report that they agreed to work with Finance Canada to consider appropriate post-funding actions, including examining legal implications and options to recoup loan forgiveness from ineligible recipients. Finance has said agreed. The department agrees to work with EDC to consider appropriate follow-up actions, including examining legal implications and options to recoup loan forgiveness from ineligible recipients. So what more are you looking for from EDC and from Finance in relation to recouping loans from ineligible recipients. But what commitment do you want to see from them? Because finance has said they agree, and EDC has said partially agree, but on that particular piece, they say they will consider appropriate post-funding actions. So presumably, we should haul them in front of us, and we should ask them what those actions are going to be.
So if you keep reading Export Development Canada's response, you'll see further on that they say that they'll only undertake the work if examination of post-funding actions identifies viable recovery options and if EDC receives revised policy direction from the Government of Canada. They currently believe they do not have the direction to do this.
Understood, but I mean, one would imagine that they are not going to pursue non-viable recovery options, so that is a bit of a moot point. On the latter point, though, in terms of revised policy direction, you got the Department of Finance Canada that is agreeing with your assessment, and presumably they would be speaking on behalf of the Government of Canada in that regard. So I think my takeaway from all of this is that we should have officials from Finance and EDC and put somewhat pointedly, perhaps, to say, what is your plan to recoup ineligible expenses?
I agree. I always encourage the Public Accounts Committee to bring in the departments so that they can hear about their responses and actions. And I am concerned about the reluctance to want to collect funds, and it's very similar to a response from our first work on CERB and Qs, where there was a reluctance to identify ineligible recipients of money. I would expect that when public funds goes to a business or an individual that is ineligible, that the government will take action to recover those funds. If they don't want to, they should just be transparent with everyone about that. Right now, there's just a reluctance to even identify if businesses are truly ineligible.
Thank you very much. That is the time. Suivant, c'est Madame Sinclair Desgagnés, s'il vous plaît, pour 6 minutes.
Ms. Sinclair Desgagnés, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you again to the Auditor General and to her team for a number of very interesting reports. It won't be surprising to you, but I'll start my questions with the report on the Canada Emergency Business Account. I had raised questions on this with the president of EDC almost a year ago in February 2024, and the information I was given by the president of the EDC is that was completely false, actually. I think there was a $250 million error in the amount with some of the companies that were involved. And then we see that there was further information that was fairly incorrect. And we see that the securities that were reported by Accenture were a bit different. And I understand that you can't go into the call centers themselves, but I understand that you can look at the parameters of the study. Now, we heard about it a little bit, but what we can see was a problem in ArriveCan is that, well, you summarize this in a couple of sentences. It's that it's the worst accounting that you've seen. Now, looking at what happened here in this project, apologies, I hear the interpretation from my colleagues' earpiece. There's, the interpretation is perfect, by the way. It's just that I'm hearing it from my neighbor. Thank you, Richard. Inaudible. You have 4 minutes and 30 seconds to develop your subject. Thank you. It's to thank the interpreters. It's always important. Thank you. Now, to summarize the situation at EDC, we can see that Accenture got $313 million, and some of that has already been spent in a number of cases. You saw that Accenture's was the one setting out the contracts, setting out the parameters, setting the price, and sometimes they even help the government in procurement. So one of their subsidiaries or themselves, they got the contract. So what were the amounts of those contracts? $36 million? The last contract, the ones they awarded to themselves, I believe it was $23 million, $28 million. I think we will check and we'll get back to you. Yes, just little numbers like that we can look for when thinking that it's tens of millions of dollars that they awarded to themselves. And then we also see that just in terms of the call centers, which is actually some of the easiest information to get. We know how many calls were received, how many hours the agents worked. Sometimes there were 14 hours per agent that was billed, even though the call center was only open for 9 hours, for example, and taxpayers saw themselves billed far more than the original price. We don't know why those prices increased. I mean, do the calls in 2023, were they worth more than the calls now? I don't think so. And what else is important to say is that the government put all the responsibility of collecting data in the hands of Accenture. That means that all the business data, even if the data belongs to the government, in theory, according to the contract, the information is still in the hands of a private company. So I'd like you to confirm. So the government has no specific plan with deadlines to really get that data back, and also the loans also, or the amounts rather. Is that right? Well, I'll answer that question in response to the first question also. Now, in terms of the contracts, it's a value of $36 million with $7 million for licensing fees. Now, it's important to recognize that the systems that are used in managing the systems are proprietary IT systems, proprietary to Accenture. So that's a contract clause that will stay with Accenture until 2028. All of that because of the COVID emergency, right? Well, at first, yes, that was the case. And while the program was ongoing, I was expecting for there to be a change to ensure that the information and the work would be repatriated within the federal government. Exactly. And now, even that contract is missing important clauses, as you mentioned, for example, to make sure that the information is repatriated within the government. And we can see from your report is that, well, because the data was in the hands of Accenture, but even in the case of there were risks that there would be only one business, that there was only one business involved, is the Department of Finance that really, that kind of didn't quite do its job and didn't make sure that there would be an open contracting program. So we just kept letting Accenture define the program, the prices, and continuing to use public money. And in the end, we don't really know what Accenture has done because, as you said, EDC didn't even take the responsibility to check whether what they were paying was really related to the services that were provided. Is that correct? Well, there were some controls, basic controls, that were missing in terms of contract management, yes. There were a number of bills that were paid without questioning any of the fees or asking for supporting evidence, for example, timesheets for some of the workers involved. So yes, we mentioned some of those bills in terms of the call center because there were too many hours that had been billed. Now, when we asked EDC the question, they went back to Accenture to find out that there was other work done that was acceptable under the contract. But it's the kind of questions and the kind of work in terms of contract management that I would have expected. Very briefly. Thank you. Now, those are questions that EDC asked when you came and asked some questions. That's right. Yes, they hadn't noticed that they had been billed for more hours than the call center had been open. Thank you very much.
Mr. Cannings, you have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for being here. It's been a very interesting morning. I'm going to follow up with some of the things that Ms. Sinclair de Gagne was talking about in terms of the CEBA loan program. You know, it seems, first of all, we have an unusual situation where the federal government hands this off to a Crown corporation to implement instead of, I mean, some federal department could have contracted this out directly. And it seems that there would have been more oversight if that was the case. And then EDC said we don't have the capacity either, so they contracted out to Accenture and then asked Accenture to write the contract, basically, because we apparently don't have time to write a proper contract. I mean, it seems to be a cascading series of handing off of responsibility. And I think that's been covered and will be covered in the future as well. But I just want to get to the, here we have over $8 billion that still has to be recovered or is outstanding, I guess you could say. I think you mentioned that 100 million of that is written off completely, and there's something like a $1 billion that is very questionable. I remember from my time I was a small business critic, I'd be talking to the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. They wanted a 1-year extension for the CEBA loan repayment. There was a 1-year extension, then they asked for a second one because companies still were recovering. That wasn't granted. But even with that extension, you say there was no clear plan how this money was going to be recovered. And one of the real problems with Accenture, it seems now, is that with the proprietary information and with the banks dealing with most of these loans, it's very difficult for the federal government to figure out how those loans are doing, how many are coming in, what the whole situation is. I just want to see if you could expand on that.
So I think your main question focuses on sort of the long-term recovery and continued management of the loans, and I think this is where this program is even again unique compared to other COVID programs. At the beginning, everyone knew this was temporary support. It is a loan program, which meant repayments were needed. The delay in decisions by the Department of Finance as to who would be managing sort of that ongoing maintenance and recovery of potential defaulted loans resulted in a continued reliance by EDC on Accenture. They decided not to do a competitive process when that was their intention in some cases. So I would have expected that because a Crown, which is normally not managing large number of small loans. EDC is about supporting exports, and they manage a small number of large loans. They had indicated that they had capacity, skills, and tools missing in order to do this, that there would have been better oversight by federal departments, that the Department of Finance and Global Affairs would have provided more guidance. In fact, Export Development Canada asked for oversight committees. They were put into place, but 4 years later, we see that this accountability void resulted in confusion as to who was supposed to be doing what. Finance thought it was oversight, Global Affairs thought it was just advice. But in the end, someone had to be responsible for collections. And you're right, a lot of information, it rests either with financial institutions and needs to be brought back into the federal public service, and that's why I'm concerned that the most recent contracts are missing some of that. This is known, and it's time to plan now to avoid further reliance on a vendor, which till now, the government is bound to Accenture till about 2028.
How much? 2 minutes? Okay.
More like 90 seconds, pardon me.
90 seconds, okay. I'm going to switch to the report on seniors. Basically, the main takeaway from this is that the government doesn't seem to know about what kind of support seniors need, let alone are we meeting them. We have a situation, for instance, the OAS, which is tied to the cost of living, went up when inflation went up, and it went up so much that the GIS payments were clawed back, and so the poorest seniors were actually getting less. It just made no sense in that regard. I'm just wondering if you could comment on those kind of situations and maybe expand on the concern that you still don't know whether seniors are facing the same cost of living increases than the rest of Canadians, and we should be focusing more on that and developing programs that make sure that the poorest of seniors can get by.
I mean, the federal government made a commitment to better understand the needs of seniors when they created a new minister for seniors. And what we found was that Employment and Social Development Canada, which supports that minister, isn't using information that's out there in order to better understand the needs, to determine whether federal programs are filling the gap or if they need to be adjusted. And so we did look at one of the significant programs ESDC administers, which is the Old Age Security Program. And you're right that there are parts to it, right? There's the basic old age security payment and the guaranteed income supplement that sits above that for even lower income seniors. Well, we see a lot of analysis about the guaranteed income supplement. We see it being adjusted during the pandemic to reflect that COVID relief might have been given to some seniors. There's very little analysis on the basic old age security payment, where most seniors are receiving. And an important factor is that it's adjusted every year for inflation based on the consumer price index. But the analysis done by the government was very weak about whether or not seniors are experiencing a different rate of inflation than what's reflected in the consumer price index, because it represents the average household. And we think a better analysis needs to be done in order to understand if this income support program, which is one of the largest programs for the federal government, is actually meeting the financial needs of seniors.
Thank you very much. That is the time. Beginning our second round, which will consist of 6 members of various times, although members might choose to split. Monsieur Beltaud, je pense que vous commencez pour 5 minutes.
I think you're starting. You have 5 minutes, please. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Ms. Hogan, very quickly, I have a lot of questions. Which department should have monitored EDC? Well, it's not easy to answer that. There are 2 departments that are involved in terms of the policy, the Department of Finance, but the department that's responsible for EDC is Global Affairs. So the 2 of them should have reached an agreement on who was responsible for what. So what you're telling me is that Minister Mélanie Joly and Minister Chrystia Freeland, those are the ones, they are the ones who would have had the responsibility of supervising EDC. In your report, we saw that EDC is facing some serious accusations from your side. For example, that there's a conflict of interest, that the Crown Corporation did not manage in the last contracted awarded Accenture, for example. Isn't that a concerning pattern? We saw it with the SDTC fund, that the government tends to give agencies billions of dollars to manage to avoid responsibility. Isn't that what we're seeing here again? The 2 departments are washing their hands of this, and then EDC does not recognize this responsibility or part of it. Do you not find that it's concerning and worrisome for taxpayers to see departments like those of Ms. Joly and Ms. Freeland really wash their hands of this kind of thing? Well, just to clarify, it's not Minister Joly who's responsible for global affairs. I'll ask somebody to find the right minister. Now, it's one of the problems when a contract is awarded to Crown corporations. The Crown Corporation needs to be independent from government, and therefore a better monitoring was required by the departments. But you're admitting that this is lack of accountability. When money, I mean, this is a lot of money, $3.5 billion that was awarded to ineligible companies, and $373 million, that's the worth of the contract that was awarded, that shouldn't have been. Now, is it correct that a large part of that money was awarded to or went to people outside of the country? You're talking about Accenture? Yes. Well, there's a number of contracts. The call center, as we confirmed with EDC, that call center is in Canada. Sometimes there is information that is saved outside of Canada, but that's information on the calls, not business information. Now, in terms of the contracts, the most recent contract for developing a software system, I believe it's people outside of Canada who are developing the system, but there's no information in that system. But in this case, it's developing the software. Thank you. I'll give my time to Mr. Roberts. 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. So my question is, from your report, number 11 of the New Horizon Seniors Program to support seniors, brought in under the previous Harper government. Can you tell me how many seniors actually received support?
I cannot tell you that because Employment and Social Development Canada could not tell me either. What they relied on was information included in the applications. Because this is a grant program, the heavy lifting is done at the front end where you determine eligibility. And eligibility was based on the number of seniors that were expected to benefit from the grants that were being received. Now, the reality could be different for so many reasons, but that information wasn't collected or gathered to be able to demonstrate.
So I'm drawn to the example of 11.51. You included in the report of a $23,000 door that was never installed and the funds were never requested back. Based on this information, do you feel this program has left itself open to fraud?
I think the paragraph that you're highlighting is an example of us saying the sort of poor management of contract files. The report that was received back from the grant recipient indicated that the door had not yet been installed. We raised that with Employment and Social Development Canada, saying, why would you close the file?
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you follow back up? So it's sort of mismanagement of files, and I would expect that they would do better. We've had them follow up, and I think they recognize that they're going above and beyond in a grant program by asking for follow-up. But when you receive information that makes you question the use of funds, you need to follow up. And so that I would expect that they'll solidify and beef up some of their follow-up.
So all the data that's collected to assess the delivery of the funds to the New Horizon Seniors Program was not used to ensure accountability, that funds were used for the purpose of benefiting seniors. Your recommendations are noted in your report. What mechanisms are in place to ensure accountability is maintained so that we avoid the fraud that's been going on?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a difficult one because it is a grant program, right? Again, all that heavy lifting is done at the front end, making sure that recipients have provided an eligible project and they are eligible. I do have to give kudos to ESDC for asking for reports back because they wanted to build a global picture about New Horizons to see whether it was supporting seniors. They've just fallen short on collecting the right information to demonstrate that.
That is the time, Ms. Roberts. I'm afraid. I apologize for that, but I've got to keep things moving along here. Ms. Yip, you have the floor, please, for 5 minutes.
Okay. Thank you for coming, and thank you for your hard work on delivering these reports. And, of course, it's extended to your entire team. My first question is regarding the CEBA. I noted here that the audit seeks to determine whether Finance Canada, Global Affairs Canada, Export Development Canada, and the CRA are involved with respect to their roles and responsibilities. It doesn't seem immediately obvious to me why Global Affairs Canada and Export Development Canada are involved. What is their role? What was their importance with respect to CEBA?
So the Canada Emergency Business Account was a COVID program where the government asked Export Development Canada, a Crown corporation, to deliver this program on their behalf. That was done because their Export Development Canada manages the Canada account on behalf of the government of Canada. It was a way to quickly get funds from the government to financial institutions so that money could get out to almost 900,000 businesses across the country. Because EDC was involved, that mechanism required its sort of home base department, which is Global Affairs, to provide it with direction. And Department of Finance was involved because they're the policy lead who designed the CEBA program and made recommendations and analysis on what the program should look like. So those two departments were providing direction on what the program looks like, but EDC was expected to deliver on the day-to-day. Canada Revenue Agency came in because it provided some much needed information on verifying the eligibility of businesses. So, for example, how much their salary was and whether they met the eligibility criteria there. So it was many parties involved in delivering this program.
Yes, I was just surprised to see GAC there. Was there any precedence before a program needing to get money out so quickly? Has that ever happened before?
Well, as I mentioned, when we did our first audits on the COVID relief programs for the wage subsidy or the Canada Emergency Release benefits, this was sort of unprecedented in Canada to see so much income support or income replacement and then supports to businesses to support Canadians through the pandemic. The government followed what is best practices in international practices when it comes to emergency. So they got money out quickly by relying on attestation with very few prepayment controls on programs, with the expectation that there be post-payment work. And that's why I'm very concerned here that Export Development Canada has only partially agreed with our recommendation on following up and recovering funds. It mirrors the same response from the Canada Revenue Agency back in 2022 when it came to the emergency wage subsidy program. I'm concerned that there is a resistance to want to follow up on recovering funds. And if the government doesn't want to do that, they should just be transparent with Canadian taxpayers.
How did Canada fare compared to other jurisdictions with similar programs internationally?
So we didn't look at whether there was a loan program like this internationally with other countries or other jurisdictions during the pandemic. I think this was just one of the supports that Canada provided to small businesses. Remember, they could ask for rent relief, they could apply for the wage subsidy, and then they could also receive this emergency loan. So we didn't look at that bucket of goods as to whether or not that was mirrored in other countries.
So I think the CSJ program is a great program for youth, and certainly in my riding of Scarborough Agincourt, the youth have really benefited in not only receiving income, but also in gaining some valuable work experience. So you've mentioned several times today about the need for greater data collection, and I'm just wondering if you could expand on that, because I know you were answering Ms. Roberts' question as well on that. So what type of data would ESDC need to collect to confirm that this program creates jobs?
I think I would highlight two areas where better information was needed by Employment and Social Development Canada to show that the program was meeting two of its key objectives. One, which was giving job opportunities to underrepresented youth. So they're called, target groups is how they had identified them, but also whether or not it was creating jobs. The Canada Summer Jobs Program is marketed as a job creation program, but Employment and Social Development Canada was only gathering information on the number of positions funded instead of the number that were created. So we did a survey of employers to find out whether or not they would have hired a youth regardless of having received the funding or not. And what was reported back was that 38% of businesses, while they did not receive Canada Summer Job Subsidies, still hired a youth. And so I would expect that ESDC would gather that kind of information to know whether or not they need to do better outreach or alter the program to actually create jobs, but then also to focus in on those facing barriers.
Et voilà, that's all your time, monsieur. Merci beaucoup. Suivant, c'est Madame Sinclair Desgagnés, s'il vous plaît.
Next is Ms. Sinclair Desgagnés for 2 minutes, 30 seconds. Now, if we look at the CBA rather again, now looking from the perspective of Canadians and Quebecers who benefited from the program, we know that there was a lot of confusion on the part of businesses on how the program was managed and so on. We know that 50,000 businesses, according to Radio-Canada, that were assessed as being ineligible and did not necessarily receive reasons why, or they only found out much later in the process. Based on a survey by the Canadian Federation of Small Business, 1/3 of the businesses that were deemed to be ineligible were told after receiving the $60,000 and were told that they had to reimburse the whole thing, the whole amount, and that they would not get any grants just a few weeks before they had to pay it back in just before January 18, 2024 or March 20, 2024. On the side of businesses, there was a lot of confusion. A lot of calls were made regarding CBAT to try to get more information. There was a call center that taxpayers were paying for, but it was run by but it was actually an organization representing small business that was getting tons of calls because there was so much confusion. So the service provided was deemed to be mediocre. Now, what is the right of businesses in terms of knowing who has their data? It may surprise a lot of businesses to know that a third party, Accenture, has access to their data. I don't know if you have any comments on that. I don't know. Your audit doesn't allow you to go talk to the businesses directly necessarily, but do you have anything to say about that? Yes, I just want to make the comment that, yes, there was a finding that it took about a year to let some businesses know that they had been deemed to be ineligible. As to the why, well, there were a lot of delays in decisions being made in terms of what was the approach, who was going to recover those costs, and so on. There was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of questions, and again, that comes back to the lack of clear roles and responsibilities in terms of the two departments and DDC. Now, as for the data, the financial institutions hold that data because businesses have agreements with those financial institutions. Now, in terms of eligibility, in terms of salaries, only Canada Revenue Agency had access to that information and confirmed with a third party that whether a business was eligible or not. For the second component, in terms of non-reportable expenditures, the businesses knew that they were providing the information to a third party to show that they were eligible. So I don't think there is too much information of the businesses that are in the hands of third parties aside from financial institutions. Thank you very much.
Mr. Cannings for 2.5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to turn to the Canada Summer Jobs Program, just because in your last comments about it just now, you mentioned that one of the things you were looking at is, would you have hired a student anyways without this funding? And here on the cover of your report on that, you have a picture of a tree planter. And tree planters, in my understanding of that industry, get paid by piecework. They get paid per tree planted. The company gets paid as a contract by the number of trees planted. They have a contract for that. And so it always seems to me that Canada Summer Jobs, when silviculture companies apply, it's like free money because they are going to get money per tree planted. The amount of money they get for a Canada Summer Jobs position is probably well below what a normal tree planter would get. And yet, I have forestry companies apply and they apply for 40 jobs and the Canada Summer Jobs gives them 40 jobs. And I have to go in there and try to adjust that to make sure other students get it, students that wouldn't be hired by different organizations. I'm just wondering, how can we change that? I know that was one of your concerns.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you're highlighting how this program is actually designed in a unique way in that elected officials can make recommendations on which businesses could receive the subsidy. The subsidy on average is about a little over $4,000 per youth over the last few years of the program. So there are priorities for the program, national priorities, which are really meant to encourage those who face barriers to access the labor market, for example, individuals with disabilities or Indigenous individuals. But then there are also the local priorities that every elected official gets to influence. Our recommendation is about aligning those a little bit better so that you can demonstrate that the program is meeting its main objectives. And one of those is gathering information about job creation. Right now, ESDC just reports on the number of jobs funded instead of the number of jobs created. So how do you know whether the program is achieving its objectives without measuring exactly that?
A very, very brief follow-up on the same topic if you have a follow-up.
Well, just to follow up on that, and the number of jobs created, Canada Summer Jobs always takes an application for 16-week job and turns it into an 8-week job. So university students need not apply when a lot of groups want university students. Any comments?
Again, I think that comes down to a policy choice on what is being funded. The job simply needs to be a minimum of 6 weeks. The rest is questions that you should put to Employment and Social Development Canada. Hopefully the committee will bring them here and we can talk about this important program.
Thank you very much. Mr. Vist, Mr. Vist, you have the floor for 5 minutes. I understand you might be sharing it. I'll let you determine when that is. Thank you.
Thank you. So on page 12 of the report, it outlines that there was no administrative oversight. Page 16 clearly outlines that there was sole source contracting. Throughout the report, it outlines that that was awarded to Accenture to the tune of $342 million. On page 19 of the report, you question whether there's any value for money in the way that these programs were administered. On page 20, you outline that EDC did not assess the reasonableness of contracts. It did not verify invoices. On page 24, you talk about a lack of ministerial oversight. On page 18, you take the bold step of stating that a Crown corporation was in conflict of interest over a program it administered on behalf of the Government of Canada. That's not stated every day by the Auditor General. So how did EDC get around these checks and balances? That's my first question. And my second question is relates to the response on page 45, where EDC states, in contravention of your recommendation, that EDC is responsible for providing oversight of the administrative expenses of the CEBA program. What recommendation would you give to this committee and to Parliament if EDC did not follow its own rules and guidelines in respect to the conflict of interest laws of Canada?
So there's a lot in your question. I think I would sum it up by saying what you're highlighting is what I'll call an accountability void. When a program was given to a Crown corporation, recognizing that a Crown corporation is supposed to remain at arm's length from the Government of Canada, it meant that the departments who were providing direction needed to exercise better oversight. And that's where Department of Finance and Global Affairs, in my mind, failed in their responsibilities. When you have this accountability void where roles and responsibilities aren't clear, what the outcome is for me is that no one was keeping an eye on the costs, that there were poor management decisions about contracts that didn't go challenged, but also no spending limits. And that's why we concluded that, that while the program met its objectives of getting funding quickly to businesses, the value for money was compromised by the extreme poor contract management by Export Development Canada, but also the lack of oversight by the two departments that should have been providing it.
It was clear in your report that the EDC and likely Finance Canada and Global Affairs Canada had a chance to make things right after the initial contracts were awarded. Yet they chose to buckle down and stick with Accenture. It almost seemed like EDC was doing everything in its power to award a multinational corporation more power and oversight to set the terms and conditions for hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars. How do we stop this from happening again?
I think at the beginning of this program, Export Development Canada made the government aware that they didn't have the capacity, the expertise, or the tools to run this program. They asked for some oversight. They informed the Department of Finance and Global Affairs that they were going to be turning to a third party to rely on them to deliver this. What I would have expected would have been better monitoring once that sort of expectation was made available by Export Development Canada. Once they said we want some oversight, more should have been put in place. When it comes to the contract, all parties involved realized after a while that they should turn to competitive contracts instead of non-competitive.
The problem is that they didn't.
Not managing that conflict of interest, in my mind, was unacceptable by EDC.
We'll stop there.
It should not be how business is done in the public service.
Mr. Lauren, you have just over a minute, please.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. So just to put this in layman's terms, so if we count a subsidiary, a wholly owned subsidiary, as being controlled by the same institution or effectively the same institution, we had Accenture contracting with Accenture for whatever they defined as the amount of money they get for whatever work they would do with taxpayers' dollars. So Accenture was effectively contracting with Accenture.
So EDC asked Accenture to run a quasi-competitive process where a few vendors were able to provide a bid to develop a loan accounting software. One of those was a wholly owned subsidiary of Accenture. In the end, the recommendation was made to Export Development Canada that wholly owned subsidiary should receive the contract. Ultimately, what happened is EDC signed a contract with Accenture in order to deliver this loan accounting software. It is that kind of lack of managing a conflict of interest that I would have expected EDC to have done better. There are clear rules and guidance in the federal public service, and they should have removed either Accenture or the wholly owned subsidiary from the process.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lawrence. And then, Ms. Khalid, you'll take us out to the end. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to Ms. Hogan and all of the officials for being here today and for your reports. I'll start just by continuing on what my colleagues have asked. What's the process, Ms. Hogan, for competitive contracts within the public service, and how long does it take?
So there's a complicated process for competitive contracts in the public service. I think that the important thing to highlight here, however, is that EDC doesn't follow the government's procurement rules.
So it's a complicated process, and during COVID, there was an urgency to ensure that small businesses, especially that were taking the CEBA loan, for example, would have delivery of funds as soon as possible, so that they wouldn't renege on their cash overtures and their obligations as well. So my question to you then is, like, what is the public services capacity in a really dire situation that small businesses were facing during COVID-19 to be able to deliver the programs as quickly as they were able to be delivered? And in your report, you mentioned that the majority of the money has been reimbursed to the government. What is the process then? Do we need to improve the public service contracting in this point?
So both the public service and the Crown Corporation in this case have exceptions to sort of competitive process in times of emergency. And that's what was used to justify the non-competitive contracts at the beginning. We saw that in many situations, and it's a very reasonable approach in order to ensure quick service to Canadians. What I would have expected is how this program carried out, that steps would have been taken to avoid that continued reliance. And currently, with the last contract that's been issued, the government is bound to Accenture till 2028 with the loan accounting software. That lack of recognizing when it's time to bring things back into the public service, I've criticized in other reports, and it's again here. That over-reliance shouldn't happen.
With respect to the CEBA loans, there have been measures taken by EDC, by the government, to bring back the money now over these past number of years. COVID lasted for about 3 years, and the impact on small businesses, I would say, was about 5 years. So when we question, and in your report, you talk about the value for the money. Well, what about the context in that value for money? How do you judge the context in terms of the dollars spent versus the impact that it had on Canadians?
It's a question that we asked ourselves at the beginning. If you look at all the administrative fees, they're low compared to the total dollar values of loans that were dispersed. Is that good value for money? Well, I'm telling you, the mismanagement of those contracts leads me to conclude that that the government compromised that value for money. It could have been done for less in a more efficient way. You're right that 91% of businesses who received the funds were eligible, but the lack of recognition at the beginning that this was a loan program and that you would have to deal with repayments and potentially collecting on defaulted loans is resulting in more costs. And that's why many of our recommendations are about improving the contract terms and conditions with Accenture as they go forward, or any other contracts.
I take exception because 91% of the businesses were eligible for the CEBA loans, and yet this report and what the opposition parties are doing is taking the 9% and really highlighting what went wrong when we know that 91% of it went right. 91% of businesses were able to take advantage of this program. And yet here we are sitting talking about 9% that were not eligible that took funding. When we know that the majority of funding has been returned to the government, that this program was executed in a really quick manner. We're talking about the difference between providing support, a lifeline now to small businesses without thinking about how efficient can we be. And in this instance, it's a 9% disefficiency, I would say. Would you agree?
So I'd like to highlight that I think our report is balanced and highlights the good and what needs to be improved, regardless of the conversations that happen about our report. We go to great lengths to remind Canadians of the good work that the public service does, and then we highlight where they can do better. And here, EDC did not use some basic controls around managing their contracts, and they could have reduced the administration fees that they have been paying in order to deliver this program. And because those costs are so low, I would expect that they wouldn't disagree with the recommendation to go collect or at least identify who is ineligible in the testing that we did and confirm whether or not collection is needed. It's a low cost. You can go figure that out.
Do you think that the majority of Canadians benefited
I'll
from
allow a
this
question,
program?
but just it is brief, please.
I think it's really difficult for us to separate whether the Canada Emergency Business Account was the thing that really helped small businesses versus rent relief or the wage subsidy. I think it's clear that many businesses needed this in order to cover non-deferrable expenses, but whether or not it in itself was the sole reason that businesses survived or not, we could not determine.
Thank you very much. That is the time. Before I adjourn, I just want to make a comment on public accounts. It seems the government has put you in a bit of a, if not tough spot, Ms. Hogan, a speedy spot in that these reports, of course, for as long as I've chaired this committee, parliamentarians have wanted the public accounts sooner rather than later. I understand you're going to get them today. Parliament will rise 2 weeks tomorrow, and generally 2 weeks is your turnaround time. I understand you're going to be working a little faster behind the scenes, and I applaud you for that. But I'd also ask you that you not make any problems your problems, that should you see something in public accounts that concerns you, to send them back to the government. It seems I always get nervous when deadlines are upon government that sometimes corners are cut. I'm sure that will not happen in your department, but we look forward to your review and those documents as soon as possible. On that note, I'll adjourn the meeting and we'll see you all back here very soon. Thank you.